In 1922, an ordinary man, a simple language teacher, woke up after a long year in a coma. However, what he brought back from this experience was anything but ordinary. Paul Amadeus Dienach woke up with an extraordinary story, one that transcends time and takes us to a distant and unimaginable future. He had not simply been unconscious during the coma, but rather, as he himself reported, lived in another time, in the year 3906, inhabiting the body of another person. His account, recorded in a diary, told surprising details about the future of humanity, advanced technologies, apocalyptic disasters, and a profound spiritual and physical transformation of the human species. It all began at a critical time in history. The 1920s were marked by scientific and social advances, but also by a terrible epidemic, encephalitis lethargica, known as sleeping sickness. It affected more than 1 million people worldwide, causing motor difficulties, speech problems, and a debilitating inability to stay awake. The disease seemed like a sentence of disconnection from reality, and Paul Dienach was one of its victims. What he experienced, however, was not just a coma, but something far beyond common comprehension. Dienach was diagnosed with encephalitis lethargica, and after brief periods of loss of consciousness, fell into a deep coma in 1921. For a year, his body lay motionless in a hospital bed in Geneva. But according to his diary, his mind and consciousness were fully active, living in the distant future, in the body of a renowned scientist named Andreas Northam. Imagine the shock of waking up in a place completely different from anything you know, surrounded by people speaking a strange language that makes no sense to you, even though you are a language teacher. Paul tried to communicate, but to no avail. His despair increased when he finally discovered that he was in the year 3906, a leap of almost 2 millennia into the future. What he saw in this new world was astonishing. As he looked out the window, Paul saw a futuristic landscape beyond all imagination of his time. Giant buildings rose into the sky, piercing the clouds, their structures shimmering and translucent, seemingly made of crystal. Vehicles moved through the air, naturally defying gravity. There was a semblance of peace in the streets, and the world seemed in order, but the cultural and temporal shocks that Paul experienced were overwhelming. He was not only in another time, he was in another body, another identity, and this realization was too much for his mind to handle, sending him into a state of panic and confusion. The doctors of the future, realizing Paul's critical condition, took care of him and called a council of wise men who sought to understand the phenomenon. They believed that he had experienced a transfer of consciousness, a rare but known phenomenon in the future, in which the soul or mind of one person is transferred to the body of another, in another time, that is, a journey through time and space. According to the wise men, time was not a straight line, and everyone's consciousness existed simultaneously in different points in time. It was a theory that defied logic, but it seemed to be the only explanation for what had happened to Paul. The wise men advised Paul to live the life of Andreas Northam and adapt to the reality of that future, while they searched for a solution to return his consciousness to his own body. He was then introduced to Stefan, Andreas's best friend, who would be his guide in this new world. Together, Stefan and Paul explored the incredible technologies and customs of the year 3906, while the professor tried to understand how that society had gotten there. Paul's descriptions of the future are detailed and impressive. He spoke of technological devices that we are beginning to recognize today. There was something similar to holograms, portable devices with three-dimensional moving images that glowed in the dark, perhaps what we now call augmented reality. He also described something very similar to the Internet, a worldwide network of information and instant communication, but which could be worked and exploited only by will. The future was not just a technological paradise. Paul discovered that the centuries from 2000 to 2300 had been extremely challenging for humanity. Overpopulation and regional conflicts had devastated the planet. In 2204, humanity took a monumental step, the colonization of Mars. This achievement brought hope, but also tragedy. In 2265, a planetary catastrophe destroyed the entire Martian colony, eliminating its 20 million inhabitants in a single catastrophic event. Earth was not spared either. In 2309, a medium-scale nuclear war devastated Europe, leaving only the Baltic and Scandinavian countries relatively untouched. This global war lasted 80 years, wiping out much of the human population. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. But in 2396, a new world government was established with the goal of ending the wars and rebuilding what was left of civilization. Over the next few centuries, society began to reform itself. The corruption that had dominated world government for 200 years was combated, and nations began to elect scientists, philosophers, and humanitarians to high office, rather than politicians and businessmen. Beginning in 2823, under the leadership of Thor Hildes, a new economic system was proposed, based not on scarcity, but on global adequacy. In this new world, people worked only 2 years of their lives in their chosen fields, and money as we know it ceased to exist. Society's focus shifted to well-being and personal, spiritual, and artistic development. As Paul delved deeper into his studies of the future, he began to understand that humanity had evolved not only technologically, but also spiritually. By 3906, humans were no longer the Homo sapiens we know. They had transformed into a new species, Homo occidentalis novus. Their minds had evolved, allowing them to develop a new sensory organ that gave them the ability to perceive a spiritual dimension beyond our physical reality. This new sense provided such intense happiness and spiritual peace that humans in that future lived in a state of constant joy. A milestone in this spiritual evolution was a phenomenon that began to occur around the year 3000. People began to experience a spiritual enlightenment so profound that it initially led to death. However, in 3382, a man named Alexis Vuk survived this enlightenment, paving the way for everyone to experience it without risk. From then on, this enlightenment became a common experience, and humanity began to live in harmony with a new expanded consciousness. Paul's account is fascinating, but also brings disturbing reflections. He reveals that humans in the future were already in contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and these civilizations were also going through their own journeys of spiritual enlightenment. After living for so long in the future, Paul began to miss his own time. The opportunity to return came unexpectedly. He fell in love with a woman named Sylvia, and during a moment of profound spiritual enlightenment, he realized that she was the reincarnation of a young woman he had once been in love with, in the village where he had lived before falling into a coma. This recognition allowed Andreas Northam's consciousness to finally return to his body, and Paul awoke in 1922 in his hospital bed in Geneva. Unfortunately, Paul's health was seriously compromised. 2 years later, he succumbed to tuberculosis, but before he died, he gave his diary to his most brilliant student, Georgios Papachatzis, without revealing the contents of the pages. Decades later, Papachatzis discovered that the pages contained an account of a journey through time and a haunting vision of the future of humanity. Whether Paul Dinock's account is an incredible adventure lived in a coma or a work of science fiction, we still don't know. But one thing is certain: this story makes us reflect on the destiny of humanity and the possibilities of what we can become.